try to use the Command Option C shortcut in Zoom, but it didn't work. So, recurrent neural networks in the brain is the topic for today. We're going to start with a pretty belabored intro of what these all mean. So, can we explain the brain? Was the questions that I just posed, and I wanted you to position yourself so that you can, see how your own mind evolves as we talk about this. And I want to go back to the Mentimeter in a moment to talk about what is a model. I'm sure that many of you will know what a model is and what is a good model, but I'm hoping that some contradictions will emerge that will give me leverage to continue the lecture. Then I'm going to talk about a pedantic but very crucial point when we're using neural networks to explain brains. And so I wanted to introduce you to the distinction between what I see as computational neuroscience on one side and neural computation on another side, so that you can place better research that you encounter in headlines and in newspapers and so forth and so on. The idea is that you're able to categorize it like perceptron. What would then be more like computational neuroscience and more neural computation, more details to come. Then I'm going to tell you about one of the big explananda of brain functions, like invariants of behavior. I will define it too, but the idea here is that, when you love, there is a part of your brain that shines, and why? And so, or when you're in a particular place, there are a couple of cells that are active. Why? And these are the same cells. Whenever you return to that same room, to that same place, that same cell is active. Whenever you hold that telephone with that hand, those neurons will be active. And so these are pretty mind-boggling facts that have been taken into account about brain function. So this will then contextualize my discussion of recurrent neural networks, and I will be focusing on the immanent property of recurrent neural networks, which is dynamics. And then I'm going to talk about how these dynamics can be exploited to use function, giving you perspective. I don't know how much, whether you're going to have questions or not about this lecture later in a test. My purpose here would be to have a lecture that is much closer to a nice YouTube video that you get the opportunity to interact. It's basically, I don't know if you're going to become a neuroscientist. I don't want that, but I do have some learning goals. And one of the main learning goals is to have a conception of how recurrent neural networks generate dynamics and how those dynamics can be used for brain function. So this is then the goal for today. And well, I should say something about yours truly. So I come from a pretty convoluted path. My name is Mario Negrello, and my path has started as a mechanical engineer in Brazil. And you see me scratching my head. That means wow, right? So back in the 90s. And I worked for Volkswagen for 10 years, like all the way to management. And I was bored. It's corporation, very interesting stuff going on, but I was bored. And then I've transitioned to master's in cognitive science in Osnabrück in Germany, which I recommend to anyone that is interested in the brain. And from there, I found a PhD in evolutionary robotics, which is basically some of what I'm going to be telling you today about, is recurrent neural networks used on the control of robots. I also worked with reinforcement learning. I have a couple of papers published on cognitive models of reinforcement learning, basically of the ability of robots telling what other robots want. So the mirror neuron background idea, some of you probably never heard about mirror neurons, but just want to mention that quickly. Now, my focus actually in life is the dynamics of recurrent neural networks. I'm interested in that across the board, like from very physiological approaches that are simulating neural networks like in the brain, with details of cells, all the way to abstractions and high-level neural networks that are used to compute robots. I have another little video here, so that was not playing for some reason. I'm actually wondering. Yeah, so the bottom video here is a good example of a simulation of one of the recurrent neural networks that I'm dealing with these days on the cerebellum. And I wrote this one book called Invariance of Behavior, and it was based on my PhD thesis, as it happens with many books. But it's trying to condense the ideas that I have on this field in a package. And so if anyone might be interested later, you can actually go deeper into some of these ideas. And so what motivates the invariance of behavior is that there's a lot of constancy and variability in the brain. I mean, like, you have different brains, but people can do more or less the same things. So the question is, what is constant for a certain function that the brain does? Like, what must be the case for a certain function to be the case in the brain? And I'm talking about cognitive function. You know, if you want to make a decision, what do you need? And so what must be constant? And what kinds of things can vary? So basically, this duality there between constancy and variability. In the brain, as you might have seen in the news, I mean, all of these things are actually from the news. There are a lot of invariances. I'm just going to mention them. Maybe you will never have heard about them, but it's the pictures speak. So where my cursor is, you have a place cells, which is a cell in the hippocampus, a neuron in the hippocampus that only activates when you're in a particular place. I mentioned it before. That's why it's called place cell. It was worth the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago. Their activities in fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, you've seen these pictures before also. So the idea is that by measuring the blood oxygenation levels in your brain, you have a proxy to the activity of certain networks in the brain, certain tissue, like, you know, basically, oh, here it's shining. If you present a picture, it's shining there. So the picture is a picture of, I don't know, a cat, a funny cat. And then you look at the brain, where this funny cat shines. And, you know, questions that we're asking is like, how do we come together about this? This one here, Schultz, is a beautiful tractography picture showing the resolution with which we can now look into the brain networks. I'm not going to discuss the others, but for you to have an idea of what do I mean when I talk about invariance, I talk both about functional invariance and structural invariances, you know, and activity invariances. And so this is a compiling slide on what kinds of approaches we have towards the brain right now. What do you measure with which technique of brain function, and what kinds of things are constant? So for example, if you measured blood flow with fMRI, you might find that fear is encoded in the amygdala, right? So this is how to read this table. Event-related potentials in electroencephalograms, you can see a particular potential, which is a particular deflection in the brain and the potential of the brain, and it encodes surprise. So whenever you're surprised, it takes 300 milliseconds and it makes a positive deflection in a particular part of your brain. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but, you know, so for you have an idea of what we are talking about when we're talking about measuring the brain and trying to figure out what it does. How does it do it? And with that, I want to give a little pause and talk about so models. Computational neuroscience versus neural computation is the discussion about what is a model and what is a good model. So come back to Menti, if you will, and go to the next slide. So my next slide is, what is a model? And if you would kindly contribute your thought to what a model is, and then we will pick up a couple to discuss. What is a model? Something. What do you think about when you think about a model? Actually, try to remove my virtual background, see if that's gonna make my video better. Lovely. So you've obviously seen this before. And that's what it is. It's an artificial representation of a phenomenon that is able to capture its main features. And then you're up to define what main features are. May I actually go one in the future? Wow, this is great. I mean, so actually we don't even need to discuss this. You know what a model is. Like this is core business in economics, right? And so I admire your tenacity with respect to this, because I often get very random comments. These feel very very sharp. Now, there's a couple of assumptions that we may even do naturally when we're thinking about a model, such as a mathematical approximation of a certain system. It doesn't need to be mathematical. A model can be a theory expressed in words. And so it's about what we think is going on, right? So, and if it's mathematical, all the better. It has actually comprised a formal representation of the reality we're trying to single out, but it doesn't necessarily need to be mathematical. It's okay if it is. So given how appropriate you were when you selected this, I am finding difficult to simulate. Okay, so good. I mean, like, this is what I was searching for. The words like efficiently, modulations, no? So as efficiently as possible. Well, this involves a certain level of subjectivity, as you would see, you know, a real life problem. Does it have to be a real life problem? In neural networks, often we're dealing with very many levels of analysis at the same time. The next slide. Actually, what is a model? So the next slide wants you to deliberate about what is a good model and what makes a model good. I mean, you all know what a model is. What is a good model? When is a model good? I mean, some of the things you meant, so accurate description of the thing it represents, complete explanation, general applicability, good accuracy, explanatory power, one that reveals true relationships between variables, good model efficiently, estimating reality with high accuracy. So the ones that indicate these kinds of desirables, I like to undermine at least a bit, because accuracy is dependent on the representational angle that you've selected. So estimating reality with high accuracy is hard, because, you know, reality doesn't really end in anything. It turtles all the way down. And so when you select a reality to represent, you're already making a lot of assumptions about what is the ontology in your reality. And so I don't know if you guys know what the word ontology is. So ontology is basically the set of words that you use in your theory. So the categories that you decided to use as things that you're going to explain.
Isn't ontology actually what describes what actually exists? That's what it's in philosophy, at least.
So an ontology of a particular problem in knowledge representation. So knowledge representation is a field under philosophy and has.
Yeah, I know. I have a master's degree in philosophy of economics.
So then as I see, for example, what's the ontology of a truck?
Of a truck?
Yeah, or what's the ontology of a city? When you go into a computer and you try to represent something, and I'm talking a little bit about the more operational level of ontologies. Yes, ontology is the study of exists.
Yeah.
But then you look into a part of problem that is of smaller scope, and you look into the things that exist in that problem, in that.
Yeah, exactly. So for a truck, that could maybe be like the atoms or something.
Yes, exactly, or neurons. But does it end there? Is it quantum necessary? So this is what I meant. I mean, like, so the idea that you have to slice a piece of reality to do it. And so when you estimate reality with high accuracy, you are actually always committed with the ontology that you as a human already have in your brain, and you're projecting that onto the problem. Does that make sense to the philosopher?
Yes,
So
yes, it does.
who is
Yeah.
actually coming in? So because I actually don't see you talking.
Yeah, I don't have my webcam on, but I
Okay,
think it's
great.
a good explanation.
Yeah, so I mean, just to give an idea of where we're coming from, right? Because when I'm going to close this for the moment. Because when we're talking about an actual problem like computational neuroscience versus neural computation, what we're often confronted with is what's the good angle, what's a good model, what does it need to have? And what we often get from neuroscientists to be is that it has to be accurate, but it also has to be efficient. And these things are often at odds with each other. Computational cost and accuracy are often not reconcilable. And this is one of the reasons why we have this distinction of approaches, but not the only. I made once a mind map to give you a certain to give an idea of what is the ontology that I am talking about when I'm trying to create this distinction between computational neuroscience and neural computation. Everything starts with kind of neurobiology, and it's basically what the brain is made of, neurons, networks with all its synapses and things, and cognitive neuroscience that studies perception, pattern cognition, and cognition in general. So memory, imagination, symbolic reason. So this is, the things we want to explain, the things we want to explain it with, right? So and then we start combining these fields in different ways. I want to first point out that theoretical neuroscience is the attempt to quantify neuroscience and to make solid formal statements about how things interact. Analysis, quantification, and statistics is often analyzed there. What's the capacity of a neural network? So of the brain. How many things can you learn? Weird questions, but you have to think about them. So like, how many patterns can a network encode, right? So you're going to go through theoretical neuroscience, and one of the sub branches of theoretical neuroscience is neurodynamics, which studies the physical models of neurons. Neurons as little cells that have electrical properties. So we would like to symbolize those electrical properties as close as possible. We want to talk about, for example, the membrane potential of the cell, that is the electrical potential that occurs between the outside and the inside of the cell. We want to represent that. It's important for us. So computational neuroscience is a simulation business. It basically takes aspects of reality, abstracts them away, and tries to simulate things. Whereas neural computation is the attempt to reproduce cognitive neuroscience with artificial neural networks. It's not machine learning. It's still a little bit like trying to emulate cognitive modeling, right? So it's trying to get the essentials that will allow for a certain explanation. So just as a mind map, the 5 branches starts with neuroscience and cognitive, and then it expands in fields with different exponenda. I made this table to summarize what I just said and expand on it. So these 2 fields, computational neuroscience and neural computation, they have slightly different explanatory goals. And so the focus of computational neuroscience is in helping neuroscientists to understand their data. So the focus is on experiment. When we do, for example, we take a neuron out of the brain and we want to know what's electrical activity is. We take a neuron in the brain and we want to know what's electrical activity is. So we focus on measurement, on hypothesis testing, on biophysics of neurons, that is the physics of biology, right? And what I wanted to then point out very quickly here is synaptic plasticity. You guys might all know what a synapse is. what a synapse is? A synapse is a contact between two neurons. Okay, so like one neuron talks to another neuron via synapse.
Yeah.
And so here, when talking about synaptic plasticity, this is the biophysical process of the changing conductance, the electrical value that one cell gives to another. Whereas in neural computation, you're really talking about learning already. You want your network to be able to do something, so it has to learn. So the distinction is between plasticity and learning. These terms often, when people come in, are used mixedly to great confusion. In computational neuroscience, we're more interested in anatomy than we're interested in some sort of abstract circuit, right? So, and when we're looking into neural networks, artificial neural networks, you might have seen the diagram with multiple artificial neural networks of different types. I'm going to bring that one in this class as well. Maybe you haven't seen it before, but it's a super cool picture that embodies a lot of the modern RNNs. They're interested in really what's the abstract circuit, what's the lattice, what's the actual motif, the regularity that I need for that function to be exploited. And particularly today, we're going to be talking about recurrent neural networks in terms of circuits. We're going to say, okay, what happens if you connect neurons to each other? So the motif, the regularity is the recurrence. Whereas in anatomy, you would look, okay, so cerebellum is connected to basal ganglia that is connected to the cortex like this, they're recurrent. So it's a level of detail question. If you want to interrupt me, just jump in, okay? So we do this. You can also raise your hand if you anything works. So I can discuss this in more detail because there are a couple of assumptions that I'm making there. What I mean when I say dimensions, for example, and you were going to be wondering, you know, what I mean, like many and few. Neural computation can have an RNN with millions of neurons, so it's millions of parameters. Still, if you look at a neuron, a single neuron has millions of parameters. So this is the difference in abstraction. And the bottom line questions in neural computation is in computational neuroscience is how much what's the level of activity, by how much this synapse change, how many spikes per second do you produce in action potentials per second in neurons. And whereas in neural computation, as I see it, you're more interested in understanding what creates a function. So what do you need for memory? Why or whence memory? Where does memory come from? Right? So like, what do you need for memory? So essentials that relate function with not. Now, computational neuroscience, this is a great example, spiking neurons in the brain. So that's you know, people ask, what is it for? It's just spiking neurons in the brain. I don't know. They're not explaining anything. Right. So basically, this spiking neurons in the brain, it has been reconstructed from brain anatomy, macaque monkey anatomy, and have been wired according to anatomy. And these neurons have been tuned to produce, they've been adjusted to produce activity at a certain firing frequency according to what the brain neurons do. And then experimentalist presses play and sees activity. And then he would look at what are the frequencies of these activities? Are there population phenomena? And you can probably see some propagation going on here. You also see some waves, as people talk about them, of propagation, or different bands of oscillation in the brain. Maybe you have heard once about alpha waves in the brain or gamma waves in the brain. This is the kind of thing we would be looking at. It's not doing anything. It's not in the world. It's not in a robot. It's not thinking, but it is simulating the activity of neural networks. The greatest example of this right now is the reconstruction of simulation in neocortical microcircuitry by Henry Markram, one of the fathers of the Human Brain Project, or maybe the main father of the Human Brain Project. So look at the size of the author list. This is what you need for modern computational neuroscience. You need a lot of work, and it's basically a lot of grinding work. You want to describe every single cell in the brain. You want their morphologies to be right. You want the genes that are expressed to be right. You want the types of cells, layer 2, 3 pyramidal cells, layer 4 pyramidal cells, layer 4, this is a medial tufted cell. So thickly tufted pyramidal cell, layer 3. You know, so we go to the level of detail and simulate those networks. Lovely simulations, but I'm going to skip it. This is a recurrent neural network, by the way. These networks, these neurons are connected to each other in a cortical column, in your sensory cortex. That indicates, you know, if you touch yourself, it will shine in your somatosensory cortex. And these are the neurons that are doing it. The quantity of predictions that we obtain from this are very compelling. One slide I'm skipping here is the 21 predictions that this model has produced for real reality. So these are things that, you know, we get from being able to do this computationally that we don't get from doing this from biology, and hence the gain of computational neuroscience. But on the other side, you have neural computation that is trying to do what we do: pattern recognition, categorization, object tracking. Oh, it's in the field. Motion perception, decision making. You guys obviously very interested in decision making procedures in cognitive organisms or models of decision making. So understanding the brain is good in that sense. I mean, but you can make a very simple decision making model too that decides as we do with 2 variables, you know. Anyways, we use statistics, but not neurons. But motor control, this is my business. I study motor control. And navigation, such as in hippocampus, basically. How do you get from place A to place B in the world? You have to think that, right? And so that you compute. Computation then here is an analogy to the calculations we need to do to achieve something. And then with some of you that said we cannot understand the brain in the future is because you think that the brain does more than just calculation. But I would be very happy if you get a model that does the calculations as we do and sounds like we do, and it has implementation very close to what we do. Then I think we're getting very close. Anyways, pattern recognition. You guys may or may not have seen a perceptron picture before, but this is perceptron from Marvin Minsky's book. I'm not going to belabor it because I think that you probably already know all about linear separation. And this is a lovely cognitive model, more modern.
University of Waterloo have built a large-scale model of a functioning brain called Spawn. The model receives its only input as a 28 by 28 pixel image.
Can you hear it?
That controls the simulated arm. In this video, we see both the activity of the various brain areas and decodings of the neural representations in those areas. The first task is a recognition task. Spawn writes the digit it sees in the image. Individual neuron voltage spikes are shown scrolling through the thought bubble at the back of the brain. The decoded value is displayed on top of that activity. The second task is called copy drawing.
Okay, I'll just show you.
The model must reproduce the style of the digit. Here.
Just wanted to show you one of these models. I mean, like there's 5 more. You can learn more about Spawn later, what it does. But it's an attempt to create spiking networks that actually do something, not like the model we just saw before. This one has strong assumptions, strong circuit assumptions about what conducts a particular action. So it will use recurrent neural networks as models of memory, right? So it's not the cells that we have in the brain. It's kind of like the architecture with spiking neurons, and a lot of our understanding of machine learning and artificial neural networks, such as, in this case, it's very important that the neurons are able to linearly decode. So linear decoding is crucial to this. And if our neurons don't do linear decoding, then these models are wrong. So see how strong it is, how much it can break someone's knee. And I think it's exciting because of that too. It makes these strong assumptions, and these strong assumptions then become very explanatory. I'm sure you, after what you said that a model is, can appreciate the depth of this statement. Now, but ultimately, you know, even though these are different, consilience would be very desirable. Consilience is a beautiful word that says that, you know, different, disparate attempts to explain something converge at one point because they're talking about the same thing. The idea that even if you're researching Actually, this is in Edward Old Wilson ecology settings. But by studying animal behavior on one side and studying, say, mass or resource consumption in the environment, you reach the same conclusions. You started separately, but because they're about only one phenomenon, you would like that they, in the end, conciliate. It's a word you probably never heard before. Is a very lovely word. When I heard it, I was very excited about it, because this is one of the goals of science. So here, the departure point is similar. Neurocomputation focuses on function. Computational neuroscience focuses on biophysics. The assumptions differ, and the explanatory goals differ at this time. Surely computational neuroscience wants to have a very detailed explanation of the brain. That's why neuroscientists go do neuroscience. Only that they understand that they first have to understand the neurons very well. So they look at the level of detail to make sense of that. And so the idea is that we're diverging now as neural computation and computational neuroscience, but we're hoping that we're going to be creating these convergences and consiliences again. I'm working on that with other people too. So this is 1744, and is the slide that allows me to cut from computational neuroscience, neurocomputation, and this preliminary thoughts about cognition and the explanation thereof, with what you're more comfortable with, neural networks, artificial neural networks. I'm still going to use terms that you're not comfortable with in this part, but it seems like a natural place for us to give a pause. I don't know what's common when you're working for 2-hour lectures.
Usually we take 10, 15 minutes, depending on the lecturer. So if you're fine with 10, 15 minutes, we can take that.
I'm super fine with 10 because I still have quite a bit to cover.
Okay, then 10 minutes.
Let's do that. So it's 17:55, right? I'm going to write it in the chat.
Yeah.
All right. See you shortly.
See you.
Okay. So this is just to remind you more or less of where we are. So we went through the intro and we talked about invariances and computational neuroscience and neurocomputational and so forth. Now I'm going to focus on recurrent neural networks, but I don't know if it's going to be what you're going to be expecting. I'm going to talk about evolution. I'm going to talk about brain activity and even some experiments. Only in the end, I'm going to talk about reservoir computing. But to get to that, I want to give you a sense of what lies within recurrent neural networks. They have this amazing power inside them, and it's still waiting to be dabbed. I mean, as a way of introduction, you probably have encountered transformers before. I heard about it now. Transformers. So transformers are like all the hype for language learning. It's big, the neural network feed forward that treats sequences not as sequences. It basically pumps the entire phrase at once at the top of the network, and the network is basically a feed forward network. And so we're going back. We started doing language analysis with sequence inputs, but now we're going back to put them all flat because it's better. We will understand all the context, but it becomes less brain-like. So if you've stumbled upon transformers, this would make sense. If you looked into LSTMs, they were already a departure from the kinds of things that we think that the brain is doing, although they're great for sequence learning. So I'm going to talk a little bit about graphs and propagation to give you the theoretical foundation of what recurrent neural networks do. Then discuss a little bit dynamics and function, and I'm going to end with reservoir computing and some thoughts on this in general. Have you guys seen this before? It's like if you can share your videos, I would. So let me see. Maybe I have more videos that I just want to get more of you, because I only have 4. No, 5. Yeah. So the more of you can come, the more I would I get like feedback. It's really easy for me to know. Okay. So here we are. Did you see this before? Can you go to the chat and say yes or no? Like the left particularly.
On the left side slide.
Yeah, so the left slide, some of you have. And I think it's a very lovely, how many of you have not? So just say no is the ones that you that haven't. We're going to go a little bit into detail on this. So few have, and most have not. So it is a lovely way to think about everything we can do. So most of these are very simple modifications of the motif of artificial neural networks. You have a certain state that represents the world. Maybe you have input neurons that are pixels. Maybe you have input neurons that are properties of characteristics of people. Maybe you have input neurons that are language. And then you have some sort of processing, and the processing is of the sort neurons get from other neurons. They sum up and they squash it via some sort of nonlinearity, or indeed, if you're doing a regression with your network, you would even have linear output functions. So, and everything, mostly everything, is about how do you connect them. So the difference between a deep convolutional neural network and a neural perceptron is really, assumptions about little pieces, how you modularize the thing. Maybe, you would like to, in your perceptron, right? So you have a pattern and you want to train your pattern. So this is what you do to the weights, really, right? So you basically imprint the pattern that you get as an input onto the weights. And maybe if you want to do convolutional neural networks, you would like to create some small set of features that you would like to use to basically localize in parts of the picture what can be there to achieve ultimately recognition invariance. If the cat is here, 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 it doesn't matter. There's a cat in the picture. So, convolution is nothing but perceptron made hierarchical and very lovingly so. In fact, maybe some of you haven't heard before about the absolutely must-read neocognitron. It was a deep learning neural network in 1977 by a Japanese guy called Fukushima. It will be in the next slide, and so you will have that reference. But you have here other, the way these things are colored, and you can find this this mostly complete chart still. It's still growing, with some symbols inside. Oh, it's a memory cell. Oh, it's a probabilistic hidden cell. The differences are tiny. I mean, it's basically how the activation function works, right? So just to give a sense of how the structure matters. And we're going to talk particularly about these kinds of networks. So like a Markov chain or a Hopfield network or a Boltzmann machine. Don't know if you guys talked about Boltzmann machine for Boltzmann machine. Apologies. Which is, did you talk about Hopfield networks at all before? Great. So wait for it. Recurrences. So what can you do if you do recurrences? Here's a contribution moment from the crowd. What can you do if you have recurrences in the network? Would you kindly contribute your intuitions about what kinds of things are recurrent neural networks good for?
If we want to have some kind of memory within the network, so if we want some information to pass through different stages, then we might use recurrent neural networks.
And why is that, Luca?
What do you mean, why is that? Why we want that?
Why is a recurrent neural network good for memory?
Because it takes information from previous steps,
yeah,
and it uses as an input.
It's basically lingering, the information lingers on the network and lingers on the dynamics. But there's another problem. If you have a small network of reciprocally connected neurons, you have memory, but it's not completely structured. Let's get to that. So actually, let me hold the problem. Anyone processing time series data? So processing time series data, and you want to make that time series be some sort of an autoregressive process that takes into account the past. And so the idea is that you put time 1, time 2, time 3, but when you reach a time 10 that you're putting in, time 1 is still basically there somewhere in the network. Now you can see how that T1 had already to mix with all of these states across the processing. And you're all thinking in the terms of discrete recurrent neural networks, which is what I'm also going to be talking about. Although I urge you to also think about continuous recurrent neural networks just in the back of your brains, because one of the great revolutions now recently in deep learning, I thought, was to get rid of this step-by-stepness of everything. Their model is differential equations, and there are effective, like beautiful gains from that. But I'm going to be discussing discrete neural networks, discrete recurrent neural networks. And particularly in the grand scheme of neural computation structure function relationships, the kinds of things that recurrent neural networks can do is they can do, for example, pattern completion. Have you ever seen the Gazzaniga triangle? It's so let me show you quickly what a Gazzaniga triangle looks like. So let me bring you to QuickTime. I had to stop it because my computer was acting. So I'm going to bring you to an iPad moment, okay? Just it's good to also have the iPad available. Where is it? It's hidden behind the Zoom. What camera is that? Oh, damn it. Apologies, I'll have to redo this. So the Gazzaniga triangle looks like this. And you all can see a triangle even though there is no triangle, right? And you can see squares or other things. You're doing pattern completion in your brains. And the kinds of things that your recurrent neural networks are good for, they're doing things like I'm reading from these pixels and writing onto these pixels so that I'm going to complete them. This is one of the things that they can do nicely. I don't know if this makes sense to you. If I have a bitmap and you want to do pattern completion with the recurrent neural network, you might want to create from the input pattern, which is the Pac-Mans, a complete triangle. And the way to do it is by having some sort of reinforcement filling in those gaps. Maybe this will make more sense in a moment. Then you have sequence generation. You talked about sequence analysis, but also sequence generation is related to recurrences. And sequence generation, more generally, you can think about motor control. You can think about the phonation device of your mouth. You're creating a sequence. You can think about navigating from place A to place B, because ultimately you need to update on the states ahead of time to create a trajectory in your brain. And ultimately, the memory is the #1 example. And we're going to talk about 2 examples of Hopfield and reservoir networks on that context. Let's go, last few considerations. So RNNs, you have the biological plausibility. So these are categories, so part of the RNN ontology, if you like. You can consider biological plausibility as something that, along the dimension. You can look into the cells. You can talk about, it's like recurrent neural networks at the level of the system, or I don't care about biological representation at all. You can talk about time, so you can have recurrent neural networks that are constantly feeding each other, or they're discrete. Spiking networks in the brain is a little bit of in between, because although action potentials are all or none events, they can come at any moment in time. So time is not discrete. Time is continuous for action potentials, even though they're on and off. So they exist in the real line, not in the integers. So you can, thinking about number systems in the back of your mind. Then you have other considerations. How do they learn? Do they even learn? Self-organization is one thing you can try. Unsupervised learning, like Hebbian learning. Have you studied Hebbian learning? Look, you're here. No? So Hebbian learning is the fundamental idea from 1948, where Donald Hebb, great psychologist, said neurons that fire together wire together. It's one of the most powerful models of unsupervised learning to date. And what happens, in addition to wiring together, the great development of unsupervised learning has been in clustering and separating the activity of neurons that are activated. Maybe you have heard about self-organizing maps. Yeah, so self-organizing maps would be one of these self-organization typical recurrent neural network type. Maybe you want to train it for doing something particular, like producing voice, like Siri. No, I don't know. And what you can also do, you can use artificial evolution to produce those recurrent neural networks. So 3 categories then. Let me tell you a little bit about biological plausibility, because it's my bread and butter. So this is the inferior olive of your cerebellum. The cerebellum is the part of your brain that helps you move properly and to basically have handwriting, impossible without cerebellum to write with your hand, or even do concerted actions, like with multiple limbs at the same time, like whatever sport you think about, you cannot do it without the cerebellum unless that part of the cerebellum is not working. So I study inferior olive. And the inferior olive has a certain connectivity. We've derived this from actual anatomy. So looking into these pictures here, we found out where cells were, and we annotated every single cell position in X, Y, Z, in volume in the brain, like the real position of the cells. And we used them to reconstruct networks. And we then used these reconstructed networks to symbolize individual elements, individual cells. So this network here is basically a representation of the connectivity of this real biological network where we assume that the dynamics of the neurons is as close as possible to what actually happens in the neurons. For instance, these neurons, they oscillate. So you're thinking obviously that recurrent neural or networks in general sum a number. In this case, each single neuron is producing an ongoing oscillation, and every neuron has a different oscillation frequency. So, and then you have to figure out, what does it do? It's recurrently connected. Every neuron here is connected to some other neuron that's connected to some other neuron that's connected to itself. Neurons in biology usually don't have autopsies, which is the synapse that that goes from the same neuron to the same neuron. When we talk about recurrences in the context of biology, we usually talk about a network that has a path, a closed path from neurons to other neurons. So this is then an imminent example of caring about biology. I want to know how the inferior olive works in terms of how the cells in the inferior olive works. Do I know how the inferior olive works? Well, you know, come to my other lectures, the neuroscience lectures. But you know, this is how we go about it. I think that we have a lot of discoveries from here, and we also produce predictions. So here on the corner, as you see the activity of these networks, what you should be noticing in the colors is that you have group-like activity. So you have sort of like clustering of these networks, right? And this is what I was trying to, so given plausible assumptions, we discover that we can emulate what we also observe in reality with correct statistics. So whatever the brain is doing, it has to go through oscillating in particular ways. No constraints. Now, I'm going to fly by these slides because I think you know all of this, but interrupt me. You use matrices to represent networks. I don't know how you've been coding your neural networks. Maybe you've been coding from the neuron-centric perspective, and then you're using Python objects where every neuron is an object that has its own state and sums. But you can also encode those networks as graphs, and there's two lovely advantages of that. One, its representation is through a matrix. There's nothing better. You know, it's concise, and you can look at it and it makes sense. So the connectivity matrices. And the second one is that you can use it directly to compute the next activity via the dot product. I mean, it is so convenient, and I'll show you how this works in a moment. But just to tell you that for all of these systems, you have graphs representing these recurrences. Neural networks, biochemical networks, such as which gene will help express what gene, public transport, and social networks, all of them you represent as networks. And the way you do it is via an adjacency matrix, a connectivity matrix. In here, what you do, yeah, I love that, Veronica. Would you mind to comment on your smile? I mean, that was brilliant.
No, I'm just writing my thesis right now, and there I'm trying to identify the social network adjacency matrices actually from the data. So that's why it looked very familiar.
Yeah, fantastic. So I use them for neural networks. Other people use them for molecular networks, and it's all about who is neighbor of whom, who talks to whom. No, I mean, so if you think about the adjacency matrix of a social network, you basically can compute from that the adjacency matrix which are the people that are most likely going to be contacted if one of your friends had COVID. So I actually had this as a midterm assignment in my computational science course in Delft. So you use these abstractions by taking a state that represents who has something and multiplying by who's going to get it. Now, how do you read the adjacency matrix? Some of you probably don't know how to read this yet, but can probably infer from the graph. If you have an undirected network, A will be connected to B, to C, to D, to E, to F. So from is a row and to is a column. Here, then you represent it. A is connected to B, C, D, E, and F. And because it's undirected, B, C, D, E, and F are also connected to A. Clear, right? You can also have a directed network, and so you see there's an upper triangular network. You can also have a weighted network, which is what we commonly use in our case. It's directed and weighted. So we want to see which neuron is connected to whom and with what weight, right? So if you're thinking about the feed-forward neural network, it will have a very particular structure. I'm going to get that in a blink. So this is the geometric structure of the brain pathways, and they're also encoded as adjacency matrices. Sorry, Luca, you're still looking. So these are from diffusion tensor imaging networks of the brain that have been separated, and they've been, and it's freaking mind-blowingly amazing that they look like matrices sometimes. The fibers cross orthogonally in many cases, but let's not even go there. What I wanted to impress you upon here is that you represent these networks that are hard to understand with matrices that are much easier to understand. So here you can see, for example, that there's modularity between certain areas of connection. You can also compare the networks from the cat and from the monkey. A and B are adjacency matrices representing connectivity of voxels on the diffusion tensor imaging. But you know, networks of the brain of a monkey in A and of a cat in B. You look at them and they have similarities. You can then start reasoning about them because you have a convenient representation. And another thing you can do is you can use the activity, the adjacency matrix directly to create activity propagation. So you might recognize the first function here. The first equation is a network equation. There's something missing, and you'll have to tell me what it is. And so here we have basically a connectivity matrix representing Wij, so it's the weight from neuron J that is impinging on neuron I. Some people use slightly different notations, but you know, that's the business. As a function of the activities of the other neurons in the previous step, so discrete. And in the bottom is the linear algebra version of it. You have an activity vector with all of the neurons involved here at time t that's multiplying an adjacency matrix and producing AT plus 1. The nice thing is that if you're evaluating the top one by one, there's one computational cost. If you're evaluating the bottom, you're basically cross-multiplying. You're using the dot product. You might want to accelerate that much faster. There's compilation things and HPC considerations, but high performance computing considerations. But in general, if you have a language that is optimized for linear algebra, such as MATLAB or SciPy, actually SciPy, Julia, so it will be happy to take a matrix and multiply by a vector. And this is then what happens. I made a little code here in MATLAB that I wanted to show you. And so that you see how you code a neural network in this style. So you can still see my screen. Then MATLAB will jump in at any moment now. As soon as I call its name, it's going to jump in. Hello, MATLAB. Yes. Okay. So what do I have here? I have a network that has a certain activity state. An activity state is this activity vector here on the right side. And basically you have the multiplication of the adjacency matrix representing that feed-forward neural network via the input that the network is receiving. In this case, I gave an input only to the first neuron, and I gave an input of amplitude 1. Now, if I click on the screen, boom, you see propagation. So this is why it's so cool to use an adjacency matrix. I mean, if you have an activity, just by doing the dot product multiplication of this matrix by this vector, you see it going forward. I don't know if you ever saw it with your mind's eye like this. And if you have, there's a couple of things to attend to. You see that the weights are growing, or the activity is growing, right? Now, what happens if you have a random network in propagation? This is a random network that I just create every time that we analyze the code, and it's an undirected weighted network, because even though it's all ones, they're multiplying. And then we have the activity vector. Now notice what happened with the activity vector as I go into the future. Time 0, time 1, time 2, time 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. What was missing in these equations? So I represented a recurrent neural network that is propagating activity over time. You start with an initial state of the whole network, and that the state of the neurons starts to grow without bounds. So what the neurons in reality have a maximum firing rate, a maximum activity rate, if you like. The number of spikes that it produces in a second is, say, 100 and not more. So you have to make a representation of the activity of the networks that somehow relates to the fact that there's a maximum. There's also a minimum, which is 0. Networks cannot fire less than no spikes. So natural representation, the sigmoid. So what was missing here is the sigmoid nonlinearity. If you just bracket now this equation by a sigmoid, you have a recurrent neural network as the ones that we use every time. Let me just show you, just for the sake of argument. I know that that was easy for you to see this already, but this is the code for the propagating network, as I was just showing you now. And there's only one line here that matters. Actually, let me mark the thing just before. Right? And if I want to now transform that network into a recurrent neural network, I do this. And then I have it for all and always. So it's very simple to code the recurrent neural network of discrete time. And it's also very interesting. When you now have a recurrent neural time like this, so let me show you what happens if you have 3 neurons only. So this is a 3, in this guy here, which was a little bit small. So let me see if I can zoom it in a bit. Oh, the zoom in is going to be a little bit disencountered. So apologies, it's going to be a little bit small. Let me explain you what you're seeing first. You're looking into what we call a phase space, where every one of the Cartesian dimensions, x, y, and z, are the activities in a 3 neuron network, okay? And this 3 neuron network has the adjacency matrix represented here by W, where my cursor is pointing. You have an activity, a starting activity, and a bias that we're adding to the network. We're basically stimulating a network via this bias. The network equation is here. And so this is the, this is Grapher, by the way. It comes bundled with any Mac OS. You might not have known that your Mac has it, but it has it, and it's amazing. It's a little, function plotter. What I'm missing here. So if I press play, I'm moving towards iterations. Let me actually hold it here. Iteration 1. This is how you read the state in the phase space of this network. The blue dot that you see over there is a combination of the activity of these 3 neurons, okay? Don't be bothered by the fact that it looks outside, it's outside of the cube. The cube continues, it's just the unit cube. Now I want the propagation of the network to go forward. And you see that although it's only 3 neurons that are propagating, the activity can become quite complex. And the trajectory that this 3 neuron network is following is actually, and I will not be able to prove this, but it's chaotic in the dynamical system sense. It's sensitive to initial conditions. It's very sensitive to initial conditions. It will make complex trajectories. So here you're seeing the sequence of states, no? First state of the network, second state, third state. If there are questions, that's a good time. I made an artificial neural network that I have the parameters for, so it's a connectivity of 3 by 3 neurons with a certain activity bias, like an input that we introduce, and then we look at the activity over time, over 100 iterates. Questions? Keyword, spontaneous dynamics. You have 3 networks in a recurrent neural network, and they produce recurrent dynamics. They produce dynamics. They are not stopping. They will never stop. And in fact, they will always do something different. So this should give you the idea that even 3 neurons, when they're recurrently connected, they have this immense dynamical potential. That's the learning goal for this month here. Questions? Do it yourself, by the way, like, code the 3 neural network and then randomize the weights and see what it does.
How does this complexity change when you add, like when you add more? Because we learn about some.
It becomes bigger.
Of course, it gets bigger, but if we think of this in terms of the brain.
If you think this in terms of the eigenvalues of the matrix, I think it's better. So the number of 3 dimensions is going to be related to the spectral radius of the matrix. So the eigenvalues and the eigenvectors of the adjacency matrix are going to be more and more orthogonal. The more neurons you add, the more dimensions, 3 dimensions you have, and different dimensions you can encode. In fact, that's what's going to be used like in a couple of slides down.
And when analyzing this, because this is a 3D plot and we have 3 inputs, so that's
so I'll show you one method, but there's a large amount of methods. One thing you can do is you basically can plot the activity vector over time, as you would even anywhere else. So so you have 3 values, so you can use, for example, a pseudo color plot in MATLAB, a p-color or ImageSC. In fact, I think that if this is I believe a script I actually ended with a clear, so I'm not going to be able to use it now. But the general idea, how the approach to analyze this, you have to look into the activity and you use the tools that you have from physics at your disposal. So you want to know, for example, where are the attractors of this network? What is an attractor? In fact, is a good question. You see that if allow me hold that thought. So how do you go about looking into this complexity, especially if it's related to brain activity? There are ways. So RNNs and attractors. Here's what happens if you take 500 neurons, artificial neurons, in a discrete neural network, and you randomize their weights. I'm going to tell you how to, so say now you compute a neural network for 600 time steps, 600 iterations. And on the left plot, here we're displaying the average activity of the network over time. So basically, you're taking the activity vector of the network, which has as many entries as neurons, so it's 500 in this case, and you're averaging the activity all out. Okay, simple. You accept that that this is easy to do for every single time step. So we're averaging the activity of the state vector for every time point. Then you can see that for 500 neurons, they have some sort of funky oscillation going on. On the right side, you see what we call the first return plot. It displays the activity of time t plus 1 versus time t. So in x-axis, you have the average activity of the network in time t, and in y, you have the average activity of the network in time t plus 1. What you then see is, because it's a discrete network, every single one of these dots is one activity that the network adopted, one place where the network can be. Couple of things to observe. This is a random network, but the neurons are not all over the place. The activity belongs to this cloud. This cloud can be thought of as an attractor. It's the place where the network likes to be if it's not, if it's firing spontaneously, okay? Just firing spontaneously. So it gives you a sense, and there are better ways to look into this, but this gives you a sense of how to start Friso. So you're looking into the average activity over time. What does the average do? It does a cloud that has a shape. What's this shape? Well, for each network, it will be different. You can also talk about the degrees of freedom, for example, via shapes like this. And shapes like this is for us humans. You can also do the analysis via eigenvalues and eigenvectors and look how many significant eigenvalues you have and find out how many dimensions are independent. There's a lot of other things you can do, Jacobians, and you can throw math at this. But the general idea is that spontaneous dynamics in this 500 neural network that's randomly recurrent is going to produce this point cloud. Then what you do is something funny. You introduce an input to the network. It's also input, random input. To each of the 500 neurons, you take a value from 0 and 1, and you give it for every single time step of the network. What you see is that the cloud now becomes this, it's almost like a limit cycle. It becomes this curve, this one-dimensional manifold where the states will exist. So we've constrained the network to produce a much lower dimensionality. Maybe these words are high, but you get the sense. So the cloud has compacted itself. It was vapor and it became a droplet. So it's a condensation going on. And this was published in 1998 by cool people. And in 2010, other cool people published this paper about, it's a meta-analysis of brain activity. It's called Stimulus Onset Quenches Neuronal Variability, a wide set cortical phenomenon. I'm not going to go into detail of this because we still have a little bit to cover, but I want to give you the sense that each of these panels here, 1 panel, 2 panels, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, is a different experimental neuroscientific paradigm where we compute, when we show a stimulus to the monkey, and say, for example, you show to the monkey a red dot. Why not? A red dot, okay? And then you see that the activity in one part of the brain, in this case LIP, lateral interparietal, reduces in variability as measured by a certain measure called the funnel factor. Other measures will converge. So in all of these cases, you have a reduction of variability once you're presented with a statics, with a stimulus that is meaningful. You can think about this like this. Close your eyes for 5 hours. You're going to be thinking about all random things. But if I present you a picture of a house, that's what you're seeing. It constrains the network variability. If you have a recurrent neural network, it will project your high dimensional state space into a lower dimensional manifold that is related to the actual stimulus you're seeing. And this is without even saying what is it doing. I didn't say what is it doing. I'm just saying that it's reducing variability. So the first study is spontaneous dynamics. What happens with random networks? This is a study of neuroscience and what happens when we give stimulus to brains. In both these cases, we see that there's a reduction of variability, and we can explain that via simplified statistics in the case of the previous slide, or at least create an analogy. What's a good model, right? So this is what I want to give you here in terms of reduction of variability from high dimensional dynamics. Allow me to move forward. So what are the functions? It spontaneously produces dynamics. What are the functions? It can generate patterns. This is related to the idea of attractors. Spontaneous dynamics is definitely related to attractors. Encoding sequences, you have attractors in your network that represent those sequences. Retrieving memories is going to a particular attractor. Having a dynamical reservoir is having a set of attractors you can occupy. What is an attractor? An attractor of a dynamical system is the set of states that the system will go to. As much definition as you need. It can be stable, it can be unstable, but in general, an attractor is a stable set of states where the neuron goes, or the network goes, and returns more or less to the same states. That's an attractor. If, for example, your neuron is firing constantly, spikes in the brain, an attractor is a circular trajectory. Well, is a limit cycle, but it's an attractor too. So even though over time it looks like they're going on into the future, if you plot it into phase space, which is phase space in dynamical systems is basically the state variables, the states themselves. If you plot the state variables, you will see that there's a cycle, and that cycle is the spike. I haven't shown you this. I mean, it goes too deep into neurodynamics. But an attractor then in general, for instance, in a predator-prey system, is an equilibrium state where the predators and prey like to be. I think maybe this in econometrics is something you've encountered before. So, okay. When you put a neural network in an organism and you look at it from the perspective of neurodynamics, you have the agent and the environment coupled with something that is happening in between the brain. So this is then how neurodynamics envisions this. You have inputs to a neural. So A is the brain as an agent with its body. E is the environment, everything that is outside. E determines what inputs will be. Where you are determines what your retinal input is in your brain. It parameterizes a recurrent neural network. Parameterizes in the same sense as we saw before, the inputs that reduce the variability, parameterization of a neural network. One parameterization makes a dynamical system which has an attractor structure, has a set of attractors that are available to it. And those attractors in the real brain are actually pumping activity to all the effector systems, to all the motor systems, to everything that comes out, which changes then the relationship of the agent to the environment. So this is what we in the business call the sensory motor loops, or the agent environment coupling, or embodied and embeddedness cognition. So cognition is embodied, it has a body. The only kind of intelligence we know has bodies. And so these are assumptions that embodied cognition makes. Analysis tools for dynamical systems, not going to go into this, but is basically plotting the activity variables in different ways. And this paper in 1905 in Artificial Intelligence, the journal, had a recurrent neural network with here, say, two neurons, Y1 and Y2. These are the activities. The dot represents the activity over time. So these are differential equations, dy dt. Thetas are biases, y's are activities, w's are weights. And he does a dynamical systems analysis of a simple two-dimensional system. Then he goes on to, so this is a continuous time recurrent neural network that is very abstract, that is not producing spikes, it's continuous. He then goes on to show that if he embeds networks such as these in stick insect robot models, basically a robot model, he is able to create networks that make the robot walk, right? Producing sequences is the intuition that you had before. So if here in A, you have the connectivity of one of these networks. Actually, you have multiple A's. On the left side of your screen, you have the actual recurrent neural network that is moving this stick to robot. Only has 5 neurons, and the effectors, the motor behavior is the foot, the backward swing, and the forward swing, which are motors or motor activations. And then you have 2 hidden neurons that are part of the recurrent neural network. And then you see the activity of these neurons over time during gait. And you see that there you can find structures or weights for this network such that you get ongoing dynamical system type activity. This is one way in which attractors become functional. I show this because very small networks, easy to understand that if you want insect to walk, you need to know, where are you on your periodic action. And so you create a dynamical system that has its state as activations of the different joint muscles. Then you produce a trajectory of the dynamical system that is cyclic in nature, that has a functional output through the body and becomes walking. The way that he got these networks was by evolving the weights. And I'm going to tell you in a moment how he uses evolution to get to these. But first, I wanted to give you a sense of how we use activity to make insects walk or recurrent neural networks. This is a 3-dimensional phase space with the activities of the 3 output neurons and the trajectory that is basically a limit cycle attractor of this foot swings. This is then broken down as a function of the different actions of the robot. Here, the robot has a forward swing, and so the piece of the trajectory over time is doing this. Is going from the combination of forward swing and lift foot and so forth and so on. So it's going here in a clockwise motion because it's periodic. So how do you go about evolving these dynamical repositories? So I want to now use the word dynamical repository for what a recurrent neural network is. A recurrent neural network, because it's connected in random ways, it has different attraction states. And so you can dab on them by giving inputs or by trying to select the weights that are neatly functional. These are great examples of embodied cyclic behavior. So my research back in the day was trying to really get to the how do you bind sensors to brain, to motors, and make them be functional. These are functions of the human brain. I'm not going to get into them, but they serve to give you a giggle, hopefully, and indicate how periodic actions can be. Surely, for example, the squirrel has not been evolved to go around in a disc player, to go around like that at all. And yet it displays this optokinetic reflex, which is a behavior that expresses itself cyclically. Pigeons and so forth and so on. So the sensors, if the sensors do the same thing, the motors start to do the same thing. And so you entrain in some sort of cyclic behavior. The paper is this: Attractor Landscapes and Active Tracking, the Neurodynamics of Embodied Action. Take a recurrent neural network, put it in a body. What does it do? The kinds of functions that we wanted to evolve look like this. Video in front of the video I want to show you. So you might not understand what you're seeing. I'm going to explain, okay? So the yellow thing on the top is a head, and it has 2 motors. The one that makes yaw, up and down, the other one that makes pitch. The fact that they're not connected doesn't matter because they're simulated, but in principle, you have a motor inside the head that does this, and a motor inside the head that does this. And you have 9 photoreceptors. You have 9 rays that are looking at the ball. And what I wanted the robot to do is to track the ball, to never lose the ball, to keep the ball in its sights. The ball is bouncing in this frame, and it's bouncing indefinitely because in the simulation environment, I reduced energy disposal to 0. So it will bounce also chaotically because of the way that this the frame is constructed, means that there will be an aperiodic way that this network is going to be bouncing up and down. So obviously this robot is able to then track the ball. And how does it do it? So the methods are these. You have small embodied neural networks, computing with discrete dynamics, as I showed you before. What you do is you use evolution. You guys know genetic algorithms? Have you ever heard about genetic algorithm? Okay, so genetic algorithm is the idea that you can solve for something via mutation and test. So you're basically, if you have a recurrent neural network, what kinds of mutations can you have? You can add a neuron, or you can add a connection. And so these are mutations. And so you can add another neuron. And then you have also a fitness function, which says, you know, if you did it right, we're going to reward you by making you reproduce. That means we take that network from the parent and we mutate it a little bit to try to get better. And then we have another generation where we measure fitness. So we do this over time. Start with a generation of random networks, put them in the environment, measure some ability. So in this case, the ability was tracking the ball, and it was computed with a fitness function that basically said, keep your sensors as active as possible, just summing over the sensors. And then select those networks that are doing the best. From those selected networks, you create offspring, 10 more networks. For each good network, you make 10 more networks and randomize them a bit. It's a little bit more sophisticated than that, but you get the idea. Evolution then will be selecting for these networks. That behavior you just saw is selected over time by randomizing the networks and eventually getting to that tracking behavior. And then you can analyze it with dynamical systems theory, which is via attractors, just like what Beer was doing a minute before. I actually copied the video here. I had forgotten. So this is then the agent environment loop I wanted to bring back. It's the embodiment of that recurrent neural network that gives it that ability. If you remove it from its meaningful environment, then it doesn't know what to do. It co-evolved with the environment it had. It constrained itself to do the function that I've prescribed in the fitness function, but within that environment that's given. I think that's actually not a bad analogy for how we do it, although it's very abstract. Okay, so I'm going to skip a bit of this because it gets a little bit in detail. But I wanted to quickly run you over the set of activities it has. And I do want one more. We're almost finished, so we might not be able to have our entire 10 minutes now. So I hope that I have your patience for another 10 minutes. Can always walk out of the Zoom as well. So here, projections of attractors to motor space as actions. I mentioned that before in the context of the stick insect to try to make it easier. But if you here have an input pattern, which are what the retina of my robot is doing, you have projection to a two-dimensional state space, and you can compute the average activity the way we computed the average activity in the other one, in the way we computed the average activity in the random neural network. And then you have an average motor output. So what the robot does is what the attractor is. Funny thing, if you now try to discover what the network does, how does it do what it does, okay? Here I have, the representation might not be completely clear, but let's start here with the graph at the right. This is mapping the activity of the horizontal motor of the robot, okay? And I am sampling for every point here in this map. I am sampling what the robot would do. I present a ball in a certain position in the visual field, and I ask, where would you look? And so it says, well, if the ball is on the right, I would look to the right. If the ball is on the left, I'm going to look on the left. Smart robot. And if the ball is kind of nowhere, I'm just going to basically be hanging out because the average activity of the motor is going to be 0. The fact that it's green, they're not perfectly 0. They average, the attractors average to 0. Maybe this is a point we don't need. For vertical, kind of the same story, slightly different. Some aspects of this also represent the fact that there's gravity in the problem. But but what I'm trying to say here is, if you want to understand what the network is doing, you have to understand what its inputs are, and you have to presume that it's a meaningful scenario. If I give random input, random output, okay? So like in the brain. So I'm going to skip to this. I'm going to skip this. I'm going to skip this as well. So you have multiple attractors, multiple actions for the same stimulus. Sometimes you can have multiple answers of the robot, and sometimes even multiple answers that are equivalent. And finally, this is what this is convergent evolution. So you know that through evolution of recurrent neural networks, and so I have a population. What happens over time? So how does these maps that are encoding the ability of the robot to do that what it does, how does it change over time? And so here we have the generation, one individual being plotted over time. And so here I have, I think, actually every 10 generations, really. What you see here is 1, 2, 3, or every 10 generations. So the robots develop that particular kind of attractor landscapes, that the particular kind of output systems to converge onto the implicitly defined behavioral function tracking that I was asking the robot to do. That is valid for all of the robots. So you have what is called convergent evolution in reality. Why do bats have wings and birds have wings? They have like very different upstream modifications. Also, why, say, the octopus developed Lance's eyes, even though he is an invertebrate. I mean, he couldn't be further away from us, right? So convergent evolution is this idea. So this then is the general idea of evolutionary robotics. So they got a genotype, transformed to phenotype, behavior, survival capacity, reproduction probability, next generation genomes. This is for you to revise later. Whoa, I copied a lot of stuff here. Hot field networks. One of the earliest networks to represent memory. Best place that I know how to learn it is this blog post. So basically, a hot field network is a fully recurrent neural network that is also symmetrical with no self-weights, where the activity is an all or none. So there's a threshold. Is this clear to everybody? So what happens when you have a model like this? Well, what happens is that Say now the pixels are neurons, and they're connected reciprocally, dynamically. You can use Hebbian learning, basically the idea that neurons that wire together, fire together, basically correlations between neurons, to train those weights. There is a way to do this, and I urge you to go into the blog and look into how it works. And then you can train multiple patterns into that network, and you can randomize the initial state a little bit. And when you say, let's start the network dynamics, what would the network do if this is the initial state? After training the weights, what would the network do? Press play, and it settles onto the desired attractor that represents that pattern we stored. If we start from a different pattern and we randomized it and we had previously trained the network to do so, when we settle, the network is eventually going to retrieve that same pattern. Isn't that lovely? Now, this network is old. It's 1981, and so there's a lot of still conceptual problems. But in terms of representation, in terms of modeling, explanatory power, is still the way we think about pattern completion. And for example, why do you see shapes in clouds? Right. So we think about, dynamically looking into something, feeding yourself with that pattern, and then retrieving from the patterns you have previously stored, which is the one that looks most similar. I'm not talking about capacity. Capacity of optical networks is dreadful. You can only record one, so it's 0.3 patterns per neuron. So basically you need, very many more neurons than you will encode patterns. But let's not go there. You can make this better. With my three last slides, I'm going to tell you one thing about reservoir networks, dynamical reservoir networks. Say you started with a random network again, and it's random. Have you guys ever heard about echo state networks? I don't think you did, right? So this is a random network in the middle here. But this is an input signal that's specified by you. And you distribute it to the neurons in this random network. And this is an output that you want to obtain. In this case, for example, the output wants to produce oscillations of different frequencies for different input signals being given, okay? How do you do this? Well, it turns out that you don't need to mess with the dynamical reservoir. You create a random network, certain properties, spectral radius under 1, but it doesn't matter. So you create a random network, and then you train the output via linear regression. Only the output weights are trained. And because it has that reservoir inside, because the dynamics inside the network is complex, you can use parts of that dynamics to produce the input you want to see. So here you see samples of what the trained network does, and how these neurons are then being combined to produce the oscillation that you want to see in the end. So here you can create a teacher signal. Not going to go with thinking in exquisite detail. Lovely resources in the internet. And if you have questions, please ask. But the idea is here. Create a recurrent neural network and train it by linear regression on the weights. That is, for every input, you need to train the weights that give you the output you want. And that's basically a one linear algebra operation. It's the cheapest it gets. I mean, you just basically use least squares minimization and you get your weights for the output. And then you get dynamics you want. How do you use this? This is an echo state network of a robot with two linked arms that has been trained to produce a figure of 8 with his arm. And obviously it can be trained to do more things. This is just a demonstrator. And the fact that for networks before the reservoir networks, the difficulty was the crossing in the middle. So the crossing in the middle made it ambiguous, and the network didn't know which state to go to. And now, ta-da, we can do this, and we can do much more. And in fact, there's one video that I might show for the straddlers, but I'm going to end it now. So Okay, here. Consider this. If you're playing the violin and you have motor behavior that you want out, you're embedded in the system, you want to create certain activity patterns from the agonist and the antagonist muscles here in terms of spikes that represent the particular strokes, not strikes, strokes. You know, détaché, martelé, or staccato. So my last slide was the next slide. Computational neuroscience is different than neural dynamics. We looked into recurrent neural networks as explanation for motor behavior. It's more like a neural computation kind of application of recurrent neural networks. Most of what I showed you. I also showed you a little bit of computational neuroscience. The search for functional dynamics leads to invariances. This ties in with what I said before. The brain has certain constancies, and we have to discover what those constancies are. It's in discovering what those constancies are that we really can ascertain ourselves that we are getting closer to understand what the brain is doing. So if you have invariances of behavior that have been attained by your networks within the scope of your evolution, we're learning. I said something abstract. Recurrent neural networks have attractors. If you look into dynamical systems, this will become exquisitely clear. I haven't done sufficiently to do so, but you get the idea, I hope. Inputs lead to reduced variability, leading also to the idea of invariances. And the attractors of recurrent neural networks can be exploited via, say, for example, reservoir networks. So, 2 hours and 3 minutes. Sorry not to give you more time. I'm happy to take millions of questions and even 10 more minutes here for those of you that are still excited. By the way, so before we go, this is Jector Weiliger, and he has 3 blog posts that are brilliant in here. So I'm going to share it with you in the group chat now too. So he done a marvelous job actually in his blog posts. I almost feel sometimes that my lectures became redundant after his blog posts.
So I had a question about analysis of complexity, because these kinds of networks and dynamic systems have very high complexity. Sometimes these complexities are hard to understand for us as humans. How do you think that trying to analyze these complexities, how do you think you can do that best? And are there limitations to how we humans look at things, like for instance 2D or 3D, if we want to analyze something in a picture? Because some thoughts are so humor is more complex than a 2D or 3D plot. It's yeah.
What a lovely question. So obviously, you know, you've been thinking about this. Humor is only partially more complex than this. First of all, you see humor. We humans see what we see. I want to start with the ontology idea to start with. What we can only explain that what we can recognize in ourselves. And partly what we're interested in explaining psychology, kinds of things we can do. If we want to explain humor, there's a lot of things you will have to involve in your networks. But before you go there, there's a lot of tools you can use to understand, for example, understanding, or to create learning. So humor is closely related to surprise and to the violation of expectation in a way that is not damaging to you or to someone you like. That's why you know, we laugh from Schadenfreude kind of jokes. So you know what humor is. We know that humor has to do with surprise. As philosophers, as onlookers, as Aristotle would do 2,500 years ago. But we also have brain measurements and we have networks. And so we start finding stuff out. We start, for example, finding out that when people are presented with humorous scenes, you have a particular EEG potential, the P300 for surprise. And you see that they also learn after it. And you see that these are in the prefrontal cortex and in the parietal cortex, or in other cortices that are involved with the type of stimulus that you've produced. Maybe it's auditory, maybe it's reading. So is it a joke you're reading? So then you start to do it psychologically, neuroscience style, where. Then once you looked at where, you say, look, but now how are they connected? Then you know more about the association cortices. And then you know about network activities. And then you know about, for example, the motor output of this, which is if you giggle, if you laugh, you will have some sort of vibratory behavior that has to come out of you. So you have a lot of, constraints, experimental, visual, psychological constraints that you use conjoined to analyze all of this. When you three-dimensional plots, who cares about the three-dimensional plots? Take the 1 million data behavior plots and project those onto the behaviors. You will find that there are covariances in the naturalistic networks that are involved in this. I'm not saying we know. I'm saying that we have the tools, and step by step, we're really adducing, and it's becoming harder and harder to say, oh, some things we cannot not do.
I clearly believe that we can. I was one of the people who think, can we understand our brain? I said, yes, of course we can, because I think these kinds of things are only a matter of time.
Yep.
And if we have enough time, we can figure out all these small parts. But during this course, I turned to a little bit more abstract thinking about this, because only getting some parts, for instance, if you have humor, you can do an ECG, or you can have some other kinds of experiments and then link the similarities between those. When you laugh, then you do certain kinds of movements. But when you think about an idea or thinking or some
spontaneous dynamics measured through fMRI.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
samples of some self really limits the possibilities of understanding these kinds of things.
Here's something funny. I like the set of experiments in which people did the following. They presented pictures to people that were awake, and then during the night they started measuring the brain activity, and then using linear regression they were able to predict 95% what the dreams were about. So, free associations in a spontaneous network with semantic value that has been evolved for 200 million years, or 2 million if you like for humans, or 400 million.
By, but the interesting thing is not like the 89% of that part. The interesting is the 2% part.
You think that only consciousness is interesting. Well, then I cannot help you, because I think that consciousness is one of the untouched problems.
Well, it's both interesting, but I'm interested by the 2%. Why can't we explain that part too? Because the explainable part, as soon as we can explain it, we can figure it out.
So some people explain it away, but I think that then you will have to talk to the philosopher. So some philosophers actually believe that there's nothing to be explained. I recommend, by the way, the artificial intelligence podcast, and actually better yet, brain inspired podcast and the artificial intelligence podcast with Lex Freeman. Probably you guys are even still already listening to it. And in the artificial intelligence one, for example, take Chalmers, which will try to convince you that consciousness, you're searching for something that isn't there. But that's I think a matter of taste. I think it's interesting to know about cognitive functions. So like as a neural engineer, I approach the problem as a neural engineer.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's less interesting because of the consciousness. I think it's more interesting. I think here, let me use the words of Gerald Edelman. Edelman wrote a book called. So let me just write the things in the chat here. Chalmers, and then. Gerald Edelman, the remembered present. Since we devolved to the 2% consciousness, I would like to point out this particular thought by Gerald Edelman. He took the three greatest unexplainables of brain, attention, memory, and consciousness, and reduced to two. He said that consciousness is attention to memories. And if you think mechanistically, if you don't think about quality, if you think mechanistically, the job of consciousness is to be a post-hoc evaluation of what you just did. It is looking into the past, and that is a state of your brain.
Yeah.
And I think it's pretty fucking amazing. If we are able to do consciousness, if we're able to do consciousness like behavior, Turing style, who cares? I think that this is going to be one of the greatest accomplishments of mankind. Now, I don't think we're going to reproduce qualia, the felt state of consciousness, until we have biological type matter. But that's only my belief. Who knows? It's religion now, so I don't know there where to land. But I think Chalmers is an interesting guy to whose opinions are also very valuable in this. More questions? Thank you, Frieza, for the question. It was great.
I think there are no questions left. Then I guess we can wrap up. Well, first of all, thank you very much for joining us, for giving us this lecture. I think it was very interesting, very much different than what we had in the previous lectures. But I guess that's also...
We knew that, right?
But that's also something that it's nice because it gives you other ideas and other things that you can look into. And I think that must have been appreciated by everyone. I guess also Evita would like to say something to the students, because actually this is our last lecture of the Excellence program.
Okay, use the time.
So
Yes.
yeah.
Yes, like usually we have a